The sky had been the color of a bruise for 5 years. Not every sky, not everywhere, but here in the California contested zone, the Velthara's atmospheric processors had shifted the light just enough that sunsets came out wrong, too purple, too slow, the clouds dragging themselves across the horizon like something wounded. Rin had stopped noticing it after the 2nd year. The 3rd year he'd started writing it down in his notebook, 1 line per evening, sky wrong again, northwest processor still running. By the 4th year he'd stopped writing it too. By the 5th he just sat on the porch with his bad legs stretched out and watched it, the way you watch something you've already accepted, and thought about his son. Kai had been 14 when the 7 bombs dropped. That was how everyone still said it, even though they hadn't been bombs in any human sense. They'd been atmospheric detonation devices, seated in the upper troposphere over 7 population centers simultaneously, each one releasing a cocktail of Velthara bioforming agents along with enough concussive force to shatter windows 200 miles out. 7 cities. 1 morning. The official Velthara governance broadcast, which ran on every frequency, which no one could jam and which played whether you wanted it to or not, called it a pacification event. Rin called it Tuesday, the day everything changed. He sat on the porch now, his notebook open on his knee, a pen tucked behind his ear. The notebook was a habit from before, when he'd been an environmental data analyst and had spent his days tracking measurements, logging anomalies, building the kind of careful record that proved something was wrong before the wrong became undeniable. Old habits. The notebook was full of observations about the Velthara now, atmospheric processor schedules, patrol routes, the specific frequency at which their drones hummed versus the frequency of a standard reconnaissance pass. He had 17 notebooks. The other 16 were in the basement wrapped in oilcloth. He'd also spent a considerable amount of time in the 1st year testing what affected the Velthara's scouting drones. He had a list. Iron oxide compounds interfered with their sensors, not blocked them, but made readings fuzzy. Certain frequencies of human vocal speech, particularly in the bass register, caused a momentary processing hiccup. His neighbor Deacon had laughed at him for that one, said it explained why the drones always seemed to pause when Rin was yelling at them. Deacon wasn't around anymore. Most people from before weren't around anymore. The porch wasn't much. The house wasn't much. But it was still standing, which put it ahead of about 60% of the structures within 10 miles. The Velthara didn't bomb what they could occupy, and what they couldn't occupy they eventually ignored, and what they ignored had a chance to survive. Rin had made the house ignorable. That had been its own kind of work. The leg had happened in year 2, during what the resistance network, such as it was, scattered and half-starved, called the Sacramento Push. It hadn't pushed very far. A piece of shrapnel from a Velthara perimeter mine had opened his left thigh down to the fascia, and the field medic who treated him had been 17 years old with a stolen veterinary kit, and the kind of determined calm that Rin still thought about sometimes. The way she'd said this is going to hurt a lot as a plain statement of fact and not an apology. It had hurt a lot. He walked with a cane now. He'd carved it himself from an old fence post, and there were notches in the handle. One for each confirmed Velthara drone he'd managed to bring down through sensor interference, and one badly aimed crossbow bolt, which was a long story. He had 11 notches. The drones were spherical, roughly the size of a basketball, and they moved in patterns that were mathematically precise, but somehow still managed to feel alive. A quality of intentionality in their path that the analytical part of Rin's brain kept trying to categorize as animal behavior before the scientific part corrected it. They navigated by a combination of atmospheric chemical sensing, acoustic mapping, and something that seemed to be a form of quantum entanglement with a central relay. His best guess, anyway, based on the way they sometimes paused simultaneously across wide distances, all of them briefly still the same way a murmuration of starlings all turns at once. He had notes on it. He had notes on everything. The list of drone interference agents had grown to 22 entries over 5 years. Most of them were things you wouldn't think of. Rendered animal fat produced a sensing shadow when applied to exterior walls in the right thickness. The carbon signature of a wood fire in a specific diameter stove was close enough to background vegetation combustion to fall below their alert threshold. Running water of sufficient volume could scatter their acoustic mapping. None of these things were weapons. They were all just ways of being less visible, ways of being the kind of background noise that systems trained to find the unusual would parse as unremarkable. He had a theory about this that he'd written in Notebook 11 in the margin where he kept his actual thoughts rather than just the data. They are looking for anomaly. We survive by becoming pattern. There is something specifically human about learning to hide in plain sight, not by pretending to be something else, but by understanding the system well enough to know what it isn't looking for. They map us. We map them. They have better maps, but we have been doing this longer. He wasn't sure it was true. He wrote it down anyway. The broadcast came at dusk, the way all governance broadcasts did, that specific purple hour light, the processors cycling down for their maintenance window, and the calm synthetic voice that the Velthara used for human communications because their actual vocal range was inaudible below 40 Hz. The voice said what it always said first. Designation, date in Velthara calendar format, local weather advisory. Then it said something new. All human residents of Sector 9 Crimson are required to present themselves at the Governance Center, Fresno Substation, on the 14th day of this cycle. Attendance is mandatory. Non-compliance will result in household relocation. This event constitutes a selection ceremony as per Governance Integration Protocol 7. Selected individuals will be afforded full governance auxiliary status and all accompanying privileges. Rin listened to it twice. Then he picked up his notebook and wrote, "They're doing another selection. Integration Protocol 7. Haven't seen that one before. Check Marcos's archive." He closed the notebook. He looked at the sky. His son was 19 years old and had been missing for 11 months. The resistance network didn't call itself anything formal. Names were a liability. But the people in it knew each other by a system of contacts and dead drops and one particular frequency on a modified shortwave radio. And when Rin limped down to the basement and turned on the radio and made the 323 knock pattern on the microphone that meant asterisk need information, not urgent, he had a response within 2 hours. The response came from a woman named Solis, who operated out of what had been a winery east of Modesto, and who had the best information network in the sector, because she'd spent 3 years cultivating informants among the humans who'd chosen governance auxiliary status, people who weren't collaborators so much as survivors, making the calculation that proximity to power was safer than opposition to it, and who sometimes, carefully, passed things along. Integration Protocol 7, Solis said. Her voice was low and flat, the way it got when the news was bad. It's a claiming protocol. The Velthara nobility, the ones in the upper caste, the hereditary governance tier, they can designate a human for personal integration. It's like a bonding ceremony. The selected human becomes part of their household. What does that mean in practice? It means the Velthara noble gets a human they can study up close, learn from. The humans who come out of it, the ones who come out, they're changed. Not biologically, not in a way you can see on the outside, but they're different, more cooperative. Some of them become the most effective governance liaisons the Velthara have. A pause. We think they do something to the stress response. Something in the neurochemistry. The human's capacity for resistance gets quieted. Is it permanent? We don't know. We've only seen the ones who cooperated with it. Rin sat with that for a moment. The basement was cold the way basements always were, the way that felt like a different country from the world above. He had a lamp running on a salvaged solar battery. The light was yellow and steady. Who's running the selection? Velshira, Solis said, and the way she said it told him the name meant something. She's the third daughter of the Velthara governance high seat. She's been in this sector for about 8 months, young by their standards but with full authority. She's been doing selections in other sectors. She has preferences. What preferences? She wants young ones, the ones who grew up in the ruins. She thinks they're the most. She uses a word that translates roughly as *unfinished. The ones who were kids when the pacification happened and have been surviving since. She believes they're more adaptable, more interesting to study, less calcified in human patterns. Another pause, shorter. She specifically requests the youngest viable warriors, fighters, the ones who have been in the resistance. Rin's hand tightened on the radio handset. Marco says she's been building a list, Solis continued. Names, kids who have been flagged in resistance actions. She's been watching. Her voice changed slightly, just slightly. Rin, Kai's name is on the list. He knew it before she said it. Had known it since the broadcast, maybe earlier. Some slow tide of knowing that had been building since Kai disappeared 11 months ago, and the rumors started filtering back through the network. Sightings near governance installation sites. A young man with Kai's build and Kai's walk who seemed to be moving freely through controlled territory, which either meant he was turned or it meant he was something else. He's not turned, Rin said. I know, Soli said. That's what worries me. He left at first light, which meant leaving at the hour when the atmospheric processors were running their dawn cycle and the drones were in their 15-minute rotation gap. He had the cane. He had the crossbow, unstrung and broken down in the pack. He had the notebook in his chest pocket, because he'd never gone anywhere without it, and he wasn't starting now. He had a thermos of coffee that was mostly chicory but still hot, and he drank it as he walked because the leg hurt more and the cold and warmth helped. The road to Fresno substation was 14 miles of what had been a state highway, and was now a governance transit corridor, which meant it was clear of debris and regularly patrolled. He didn't walk the road. He walked parallel to it, through what had been agricultural land and was now left fallow. The Velthara had no interest in human agriculture, and had made no effort to either support or destroy it, which meant the fields had gone back to something wild and tangled and full of useful cover. He moved through it the way you learned to move through it, slow and low when the drones passed, quick and direct in the gaps. He was thinking about a barbecue. This was a thing that happened sometimes, the mind reaching back for something warm to hold onto while the body did the hard work of surviving. It had been the summer before the pacification. Kai had been 13, at that age where everything a parent said was either embarrassing or irrelevant, but who had still come to the barbecue because Rin's friend Marcus had been doing the cooking and Marcus made ribs that were worth the embarrassment of being seen with your father. The whole neighborhood had been there, Marcus and his wife, their kids, old Deacon from next door with his perpetually broken lawn chair, Sharon from across the street who always brought that potato salad that nobody could quite identify but everyone ate anyway. Someone had brought a speaker, and old music played at the volume that meant celebration without effort, the kind of music nobody put on deliberately but everyone was secretly glad to hear. The summer had been hot and ordinary and Kai had spent most of it with his phone and his headphones and had still, at some point in the evening, ended up sitting next to Rin on the porch steps watching the fireflies, not saying anything in particular, just present. Rin had passed him a soda. Kai had taken it without looking up. The fireflies had done their slow blinking thing in the long grass at the edge of the yard, and a song had come through the speaker that Rin recognized from somewhere older than memory, something his mother had sung, and he'd hummed it under his breath without thinking about it, and Kai had said without looking up, "What is that?" And Rin had said, "Something from before I was old," and Kai had said, "Hum it again." He had. Kai had listened with his eyes still on the fireflies, processing it the way he processed everything, not passively, not carelessly, but storing it somewhere, filing it in whatever system his son used to organize the world into things that mattered and things that didn't. Rin didn't know when he'd started treasuring ordinary silences. Probably around the time ordinary became impossible. He found himself humming the same song now, walking the fallow fields, low enough that only the grasses could hear him. The leg hurt. The sky was wrong. 14 miles wasn't that far. The Fresno substation came into view around noon. A complex of Velthara prefab structures arranged around what had been a water treatment facility. The alien architecture sitting on top of human foundations, the way something does when it doesn't need to make sense of what it replaced. The Velthara built in curves and spirals, everything slightly off-axis, and the effect of their structures on human eyes was a persistent mild disorientation, a feeling that you couldn't quite find the center of anything. Rin had read, in one of the pre-pacification academic papers he'd found in a university archive, that this was apparently a deliberate design choice. Velthara civic architecture was engineered to prevent the feeling of belonging in anyone who hadn't been acculturated to it from birth. The crowd assembling outside was 300 people at least, more filtering in from the roads, all of them Sector 9 Crimson, which meant all of them people who had survived 5 years in the same conditions Rin had survived them in, not untouched, not unchanged, but still here and still themselves mostly. He recognized faces. He recognized the way people moved in controlled space, the particular set of the shoulders that meant I'm doing what I'm told, but I want you to know I know what I'm doing. He found Solis near the eastern perimeter. He knew her by her jacket, the same olive-green canvas jacket she'd worn every time he'd seen her, worn through at the elbows and patched with what looked like sail canvas. She was a small woman with gray-streaked hair and the patient, measuring eyes of someone who spent a lot of time watching things that mattered. She'd been running her information network out of the old winery for 3 years and hadn't been caught yet, which wasn't luck. It was the same principle as making the house ignorable. She had made herself indispensable to enough people on both sides of the line that being noticed was more disruptive than being overlooked. "He's here," she said without preamble. "Kai." Inside, already inside. He came in last night with the preliminary group, the ones the Velthara flagged in advance. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her face that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite hope and existed in the complicated space between. "He looks okay, Rin. He looks like himself." "Is he himself?" She didn't answer immediately. "He's been moving through governance territory for 11 months, she finally said. "Getting close to them, learning them. He said word came through the network about a month ago from one of my contacts inside. He said he was building something, some kind of understanding. He wouldn't say more than that." Rin looked at the substation, at the curves and spirals of Velthara architecture sitting on human foundations. He thought about his notebook. He thought about the specific patience required to watch something long enough to understand it. "That sounds like him," he said. "It also sounds like exactly what Velshira is looking for in a selection candidate," Solis said. "Someone who has been close to them and is still intact, still themselves. She'll see it as an opportunity. A human who has spent 11 months in proximity to governance operations and has survived that proximity. She'll want to know how. She'll think the integration will answer it." "It won't." "No," Solis agreed. "It won't, which is either the best possible outcome or the most dangerous one, depending on how she responds to failure." Rin had spent 5 years taking careful measurements and building careful records. He had learned in that time the difference between the kind of danger that wanted to destroy you and the kind that wanted to understand you. The first kind was harder to survive. The second kind, if you were careful, if you were patient, if you kept writing things down, the second kind could be worked with. He thought about Velthira's name, the way Solis had said it. 47 integrations, a noble with authority and a methodology and a question she couldn't answer yet, a question about why they kept changing. He had 17 notebooks worth of thoughts about that question. "I'm going in," he said. Rin thought about his son at 19. 19 was the age he'd been when he drove across the country alone with nothing but a road atlas and a thermos, and the specific arrogance of being young enough to believe that things worked out. He thought about Kai at 13 on the porch steps with the fireflies. He thought about Kai at 14 the morning the sky went wrong, standing in the doorway of the house with that expression he'd had, not afraid exactly, but recording. The way he'd looked at everything that morning like he was memorizing it for later. He pushed through to the front of the crowd. Velshira arrived the way Velthara nobility always arrived, without announcement, without ceremony that human eyes could parse, simply present in a space where she hadn't been a moment before. The spatial relocation technology was one of the things that still did something to Rin's stomach, even after 5 years. The way you looked away and looked back and the equation of the room had changed. She was tall in the way that all Velthara were tall, which was not quite the same as the way tall humans were tall. Something about the proportion of limb to torso, the way their joints articulated, made them seem to occupy more vertical space than their actual height justified. She was wearing the formal Velthara governance attire that Rin had only seen in broadcasts before. A kind of structured layering of materials that moved with her like something alive, colors that shifted in the edges of perception, deep burgundy going to black, going to the specific purple of a California bruised sky. Her face was the thing that caught you, because the Velthara face was close enough to human that you kept trying to read it the way you read a human face, and it kept not quite mapping. The eyes were the right shape but set slightly too far apart, and the color was solid, no white, no iris pupil distinction, just a uniform deep amber. The features were arranged in a pattern that suggested emotion without confirming it, an expression that might have been curiosity or hunger or aesthetic appreciation, and probably, Rin thought, was all three of those things at once. She walked through the assembled crowd slowly. There were Velthara guards at intervals, not pointed weapons, nothing overtly threatening, just presence. And there was a human liaison in governance auxiliary dress walking 2 steps behind her who was murmuring translations, though Velshira herself spoke no words. She communicated with her attendants in subvocalizations below human hearing range, and the humans watched the translation feed on small displays that the liaison held up periodically. Rin watched her walk. She was studying the crowd the way a researcher studies a dataset. He recognized the gesture, not because he'd seen Velthara do it before, but because he'd done it himself, standing over a printout of atmospheric readings at 2 in the morning, looking for the pattern. She was looking for something specific. She had criteria. She was running assessments against them in real time. She stopped 3 times. The first stop was in front of a young woman, maybe 22, who had the look of someone who'd been in active resistance for a long time, a specific quality of stillness that was the opposite of fear, a readiness. Velshira looked at her for a long moment, then moved on. The second stop was in front of a young man, 18, who was trembling slightly and trying not to. Velthara looked at him with what the liaison's display rendered as asterisk evaluation, insufficient volatility markers, then moved on. The third stop was in front of a doorway. Kai was standing in the doorway. Rin saw his son and felt the bottom drop out of his chest for just a moment, the involuntary reassembly of hope that he'd been keeping controlled for 11 months. Kai was taller than he remembered, which was stupid because of course he was taller, but the body registered it as a surprise anyway. He had a cut along his jaw that was healed but recent. He was standing the way Rin had never quite taught him to stand, a quality of ease that wasn't carelessness, a quality of being exactly here and not somewhere else. He was looking at Velshira with the same expression he'd had at 14 in the doorway of the house, recording. Velshira stopped. She was still for a long time, long enough that the crowd noticed and the ambient sound changed. Then she raised one hand, long fingers, that joint articulation that didn't quite track right, and pointed at Kai. The liaison's display read, "This one. He will be mine." They didn't physically restrain him. They didn't need to. The terms of Integration Protocol 7 were known. Selected individuals who refused were not harmed, but their families were relocated, their households dissolved, and they themselves were classified as governance non-cooperative, which in practice meant a lifetime of the hardest assignments and the worst rations and the permanent attention of the patrol routes. Most people didn't refuse. Kai didn't refuse. He looked at his father once, across the crowd, and in that look was something that Rin spent the next 4 hours trying to read while he followed the processing line at as close a distance as the guards allowed. Not resignation, not fear. Something that was maybe close to what Rin had felt, years ago, following a reading that didn't make sense, not satisfied with the measurement, convinced that the measurement was telling him something important that he hadn't yet understood. The selection processing was held in what had been the water treatment facility's main operations room, which the Velthara had converted into something that was equal parts administrative space, and Rin had no better word for it, ceremonial chamber. The equipment wasn't recognizably equipment. It looked organic, the way Velthara technology often did, curving surfaces that might have been grown rather than manufactured, soft bioluminescent light in a spectrum that sat at the edge of human vision. Rin got to a window. He bribed his way there with the last of his coffee and 3 cans of food from the pack, a transaction so human and so small that he almost smiled at it. The woman who brokered it was named Petra, 70-something, who had been in Sector 9 Crimson since before the pacification, and who seemed to know every sightline in every Velthara-controlled structure within 20 miles. She pointed him to a maintenance corridor and told him the window at the end would be unlocked, because the Velthara had disabled the mechanism 3 years ago when it was interfering with a sensor array, and had never gotten around to replacing it. "How do you know that?" Rin asked. Petra looked at him the way people looked at him when he asked obvious questions. "I watch things," she said. He thought about that, walking the corridor. The specific human activity of watching things, carefully, persistently, without any clear goal beyond the watching itself. He thought about how many Petras there might be in how many corridors. How many people across how many contested zones who had responded to occupation by paying very close attention and writing nothing down, keeping it all in their heads, building their own internal maps of where the locks were disabled, and where the rotations had gaps, and what the Velthara couldn't see from where they were standing. Unwritten notebooks everywhere. He watched through the milky scratched glass. What he saw was his son sitting in a chair that was too large for human proportions, and Velshira standing before him, and something happening between them that Rin couldn't precisely identify. It wasn't a medical procedure. It wasn't a conversation in any form he recognized. It looked more like attention, an intensity of focus, Velthara to human, that was almost tangible through the glass. She was reaching toward Kai, not physically, but in some other register, something in the quality of her stillness that suggested extension. And Kai sat receiving whatever it was with his eyes open and his hands loose in his lap, and an expression that Rin knew from 100 different contexts. "I am learning something and I don't want to interrupt it." The reach failed. He could tell because Velshira changed subtly, the way a dataset changes when a model breaks, a recalibration happening under the surface. She tried again. Kai's expression didn't change. Same calm, same receiving attention. The anchor forming and then, somewhere deeper, something moving that wasn't where she'd reached. She tried a 3rd time, a 4th. Then she stopped and simply stood, and for a long time both of them were still, and then Kai said something, and Rin watched Velshira's reaction, and the reaction was not anger, not frustration. Something closer to the thing Rin felt when a measurement came back wrong in a way that was interesting rather than inconvenient. Something lit up behind those amber eyes. She sat down on the floor. Rin stood at the window for a long time after that, watching his son talk to an alien princess who had chosen him, and then found something she hadn't chosen underneath. The bonding process was supposed to take 3 days. On the morning of the second day, the Velthara guards on the eastern perimeter went through a rotation that left a gap of 4 minutes. Rin had been counting from before dawn. He was through the gap and into the secondary corridor before the rotation completed. He found Solis already inside, which didn't surprise him. "Something's happening," Solis said quietly. She had that expression again, the one that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite pity. "My contact inside says the ceremony isn't proceeding normally. Velshira is frustrated isn't the right word. More like confused. The integration isn't taking." "What does that mean?" "The bonding process works by establishing a kind of resonance. The Velthara noble's consciousness extends toward the selected human and finds anchor points, patterns of thought and response that can be aligned slowly until the human's threat response to the noble is restructured. The human stops perceiving the noble as a threat, starts perceiving them as Solis paused, finding the word necessary. And Kai's not anchoring. Kai's not anchoring. My contact says Velshira has tried 4 times. The anchor forms and then she made a gesture with her hand like something slipping free. She keeps finding something wrong. Not wrong like broken. Wrong like there's always something else there. Something underneath the thing she's reaching for. Something she can't map." Rin thought about his son at 7 years old, lying on his stomach in the backyard, watching an anthill for 3 hours without moving. Thought about Kai at 10, taking apart every piece of electronics in the house and rebuilding them slightly different. Thought about Kai at 13, memorizing the argument structure of 3 different philosophical positions on free will because he'd had a bet with a classmate. He thought about what Solis had said. She believes they're more adaptable, more interesting to study, less calcified in human patterns. She had picked Kai because he was unpredictable, because he was unfinished in the Velthara sense. She had not considered that unfinished, in the human sense, could mean something entirely different. "Where is he?" Rin asked. The integration chamber was smaller than the operations room, a side chamber, bioluminescent panels running low. The temperature kept it something that was comfortable for Velthara and merely warm for humans. Kai was sitting cross-legged on the floor, not in the chair, which was interesting, and Velshira was across from him, also on the floor, which Rin had never seen a Velthara noble do, and which apparently was not standard protocol. They were, as far as Rin could tell, talking. He got to the door. The guards were not in position. They had been shifted to the eastern perimeter in response to what turned out to be a deliberate distraction that Solis had apparently arranged, which she had not told him about, which was typical. He pushed the door open. Kai looked up. There was a moment where Rin tried to read his son's face and found it clearly and completely, and understood that Kai was not only himself, but more himself than Rin had seen in years. That 11 months in the ruins, 11 months of moving through occupied territory, 11 months of watching and learning and recording, had not diminished him but had done something else entirely, had filled something in. Velshira turned to look at Rin. Up close he'd expected something, some reaction in himself, fear or awe or the specific human response to a predator. What he felt instead was the thing he felt looking at a data set that was more complex than he'd accounted for. Interest. The recognition of something that had its own internal logic. She spoke, below human hearing range, subvocalized, and the words weren't for him. But Kai, who had spent 11 months in close proximity to the Velthara, who had been sitting in a room with her for 2 days, said quietly, "She wants to know who you are. Tell her I'm your father." Kai said something in return, not in words Rin recognized, a pattern of sounds that sat at the edges of what human vocal anatomy could produce. approximating Velthara communication frequencies. Rin stared at his son. Velshira's response was immediate and unambiguous even without translation. She turned back to Kai and the subvocalizations were rapid and different, not the ceremonial register. Something faster, something that read like shock. What did she say? Rin asked. She said, Kai paused, finding the translation. She said it's impossible for a human to learn Velthara subsonic communication in under a year. She said the resonance frequencies required a Velthara-structured neural process to produce. He almost smiled. I told her I didn't do it on purpose. I just kept listening. Rin crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside his son, because his leg was hurting and because he was tired, and because he was not going to stand over this conversation like someone waiting for a verdict. He uncapped the thermos. There was still an inch of coffee in it, cold now. He offered it to Kai. Kai took it, drank, handed it back. Velshira watched this with the amber-solid eyes and said nothing for a long moment. Then she spoke again, and Kai listened, and this time when he translated there was something in his voice that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite making it. She says the integration failed because every time she found an anchor point in my pattern, every time she found something to align to, there was always something underneath it that didn't fit. She could reach the part of me that was afraid, and then the part of me that was curious about the fear would come up. She could reach the part that was in pain, and then the part that was cataloging the pain would come up. She said, he stopped. What? She said it was like trying to hold water. Every time she got a grip on something it became something else. A pause. She said she's done 47 integrations. She said she's never had one fail. She said the failure was hers, not mine. She's been trying to understand what she missed in her assessment. Rin looked at Velshira. He thought about 47 integrations. He thought about 47 humans who had gone in and come out different, quieted, the resistance in them reshaped into something cooperative. He thought about what that meant, not as an abstraction, but as 47 specific people, 47 specific losses. He thought about his notebook, 17 notebooks, 5 years of measuring and recording and cataloging. He said slowly, ask her what she's looking for, in the selection, what specifically she's trying to study. Kai looked at him, then looked at Velshira and produced the subsonic approximation. The answer was longer than Rin expected. He watched Velshira's face while she spoke and tried to map it as a dataset without assuming what it meant, and when she finished, he looked at Kai. She says, Kai took a slow breath. She says the Velthara have been studying humanity for 112 years before the pacification. She says every model predicted that a species at our developmental stage, facing a technologically superior occupation, would have a predictable response arc, resistance decreasing over 2 to 3 generations as the superior technology became culturally normalized. The occupied species integrates, adapts, and eventually becomes, he found the word. Stable. She says our models are breaking. The resistance isn't decreasing. She says the word is asterisk ramifying, branching, splitting into new forms faster than they can be mapped. She says she came to this sector because it has the highest concentration of individuals like me, the ones who grew up in the occupation. She thought, he stopped again. She thought she could understand it by bonding with one of us, Rin said. She thought if she could hold one of us still long enough, she could understand why we keep changing. Silence in the small, warm room. The bioluminescent panels breathed their slow light. Rin looked at Velshira for a long moment. He thought about everything he'd spent 5 years measuring and recording and mapping. He thought about his 17 notebooks. He thought about the specific knowledge that came from 5 years of watching something closely enough to find its gaps. The drone rotation, the sensor frequencies, the way certain substances interfered with certain readings. He reached into his pack. He took out the most recent notebook and placed it on the floor between himself and Velshira. She looked at him. Tell her, Rin said to Kai, that I've been studying them for 5 years too. Tell her I'll answer her questions about why we keep changing, if she answers mine about why they stopped. Kai was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad. Tell her. Dad, she's Velthara Highseat Tier. She doesn't. She's sitting on the floor talking to a 19-year-old because her best tool failed and she doesn't know why, Rin said. That's not someone who doesn't negotiate. That's someone who's desperate enough to try something new. Kai looked at his father. That expression again, not quite a smile but related to one. He turned to Velshira and spoke. What happened next took 4 hours and was conducted in a combination of Kai's improvised subsonic approximations, the liaison's translation feed which Solis had apparently repurposed for their use, and Rin's notebook, which Velshira turned through with what Rin had to admit looked like genuine absorption. She turned pages the way a reader turned pages, not scanning, not processing at the speed her kind could process, but slowly, letting each page arrive. She asked about the drone observations. He explained them, the iron oxide effect, the bass frequency hiccup, the 14-day rotation pattern that he'd mapped in Notebook 7. She asked why he'd bothered to write it down when he could have kept it in his head, and he said that things written down could be given to someone else, and she sat with that for a long time before Kai translated what she said next. In Velthara record-keeping, information is stored in biological memory matrices and is not transferable between individuals. The concept of deliberately creating a record for another person to access is, she doesn't have a word for it. She says it sounds like building something you might not live to use. That's exactly what it is, Rin said. He asked her why the Velthara atmospheric processors ran on a predictable schedule when a randomized schedule would be tactically superior. She said the processors required synchronized maintenance cycles that couldn't be randomized without reducing efficiency by 31%, and that the high seat had determined 31% efficiency loss was unacceptable. He wrote that down without comment, and she watched him write it, watched him record, in his own notebook, information she had just given him about their infrastructure, and said nothing. Which was itself information. He asked her how many planets they'd occupied. Kai translated. Velshira answered. Kai said, 14 over 200 years. She says this is the 14th. What happened to the others? A longer answer. Kai worked through it. She says all 14 are currently under Velthara governance. Stable. Integrated. She says the integration of a new species typically takes between 50 and 200 years, depending on, she uses a word that means something between asterisk complexity asterisk and stubbornness. How long did the others take? Longest was 180 years. Average is about 90. And us? Kai was quiet for a moment. Then, she says the current projection has been revised 4 times in 5 years. She says the models keep coming out longer than the previous revision. What's the current projection? A pause. Kai looked at Velshira. She said something short and not quite flat. He turned back to Rin. She says the modeling division stopped generating projections for humanity 6 months ago. She says every time they build a new model, the data it generates is obsolete before the model is complete. Rin wrote that down too. She asked why human resistance ramified instead of diminishing. He said, because we don't all respond the same way. One person sees the occupation and becomes a fighter. One person sees it and becomes a record keeper. One person sees it and spends 11 months learning to approximate Velthara subsonic communication without knowing why. The occupation tries to find the pattern of resistance to counter it, and every time it counters one pattern, 3 new patterns emerge because the countering itself becomes something humans respond to. You're not fighting a strategy. You're fighting he looked for the word, a process, an ongoing generation of responses. Velshira was still for a long time. Then she said something, and Kai translated slowly. She says the Velthara models are built on the assumption that all intelligent species have a stable core, a fundamental pattern of values and responses that can be identified and predicted. She says every species they've encountered has had this. She says, he paused. She says she's beginning to think humans might not have one. Is that a bad thing for her? Kai asked, translated. She says it's the most interesting thing she's encountered in 40 years of governance work. Tell her that's very flattering, Rin said, and that I'd like my son to leave with me when this is done. Kai translated. Velshira responded. Kai was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet when he was weighing something. She says the integration protocol requires a selection to be completed, he said finally. If she releases me without completing it, there are procedural consequences for her within the governance structure. She can't just let me walk out. Rin looked at Velshira. He thought about 47 integrations. He thought about the way she was sitting on the floor, which was not how this was supposed to go. He thought about the notebook in her hands, the way she'd turned the pages, the quality of attention she'd given to 5 years of a human man writing down everything he noticed. He said, what if the integration completes and the result is this? What we've been doing for the last 4 hours. What if the product of the selection is a channel of information rather than a quieted human? Kai was very still. Rin continued, I'm offering her something worth more than a cooperation-conditioned liaison. I'm offering her a human who will talk to her honestly about what we are and why we work the way we work. One who hasn't been adjusted so the information is real. One who will answer questions she can't get answered any other way. He looked at Kai. If Kai agrees. Kai looked at his father for a long moment. That expression, the one from the doorway at 14, the one from across the crowd yesterday. Recording. You built this, Kai said, not accusing, recognizing. I just followed the data. The whole 11 months, you knew where I was. I knew roughly where you were. Solis' contacts had you near the governance installations most of the time. I knew what you were doing, or I knew enough to make a guess that felt right. And you waited. You weren't ready to come back yet, weren't done with whatever you were building. Rin looked at his son, at the cut on his jaw, at the quality of stillness in him that hadn't been there at 18. Were you? Kai was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence but accumulation. I went in trying to understand how they thought, he said, how they processed things, what patterns they were running. I got close to 3 different installations over 11 months, got close enough that the patrols stopped noting me as an anomaly. I became background. Pattern, not anomaly. Rin looked at him. You read the notebooks. Notebooks 3 through 12. Before I left, I had them mostly memorized. The almost smile again. I always read your notebooks. There was something in that, in the image of his son reading 17 years of careful observation, taking it in, building his own version of the methodology, that Rin couldn't quite hold all at once. He let it sit. What did you find? He asked. In the installations. That they're not afraid of us, Kai said. They're confused by us. There's a difference. Fear makes you want to end something. Confusion makes you want to understand it. If she's confused, he glanced at Velshira, who was watching this exchange with the total attention she'd been bringing to everything. If she's confused enough to sit on the floor instead of standing over us, then confusion is something we can work with. Kai turned to Velshira. He spoke for a long time, longer than translation, longer than approximation. Rin listened to the subsonic resonance of it, the sounds his son had taught himself by listening for 11 months in the dark, moving through occupied territory as deliberately as water finding its level. He realized it wasn't just translation. It was an argument, a complete, structured argument built on 5 years of his father's notebooks and 11 months of his own careful observation, delivered in a language he had no business speaking. Velshira listened. She turned the last pages of the notebook. She looked at the final entry, sky wrong again, northwest processor still running, sun still missing. She spoke short, definitive. Kai looked at Rin. She says yes. She says the integration will be recorded as complete with an unconventional outcome under her personal authority. She says she wants monthly correspondence. She says, a pause. She says she's going to have to revise an assumption she's held for 40 years, and she wants a record of what caused the revision. What assumption? That every intelligent species at base wants to be stable. Kai's almost smile again, fuller now. She says she thinks humans might actually prefer to be. She uses a word that translates closest to in motion. Rin thought about the barbecue. He thought about Kai at 13 with his headphones in, present and elsewhere simultaneously. He thought about 17 notebooks and 11 months of silence, and a thermos of cold coffee passed between a father and his son on the floor of an alien integration chamber. He thought about being 19 with a road atlas and a thermos, driving west for no reason except that west was where he hadn't been yet. He closed his notebook and put it back in his chest pocket. Tell her, he said to Kai, that she's not wrong. They left the substation as the sun was going wrong purple again in the west, the processors cycling into their evening maintenance window. 300 people had arrived for the selection. They were dispersing now, in the specific way people dispersed when they'd survived another official event. Not rushing, not relieved exactly, just continuing, putting one foot after another in the direction of wherever continuing took them. Kai walked next to his father, the cane on the left, the sun on the right, the road under both of them. You knew it wasn't going to work on me, Kai said, not quite a question. I didn't know, I hoped. Because I'm weird. Because you were always the kind of person who couldn't hold still long enough to be mapped. Rin looked at his son. When you were 7, you watched an anthill for 3 hours. I remember that. You came inside and I asked you what you'd learned and you said the ants didn't seem to know they were ants. You said they just kept going because going was what they did. You said you thought that was probably true of most things. He paused. You were 7. Kai was quiet for a moment. The road wound west through the fallow fields, the tangled growth that was reclaiming what had been planted and arranged into something wilder. What's the monthly correspondence going to look like? He said. I don't know yet. I've never corresponded with a Velthara noble before. She's going to ask hard questions. So am I. Solis fell in beside them about a mile out from the substation, appearing from the tree line the way she always did, simply present in a space where she hadn't been. She looked at Kai and then at Rin, and then at Kai again, and her face went through something complicated that she resolved into her usual careful neutrality. Unconventional outcome, she said. My son has that effect. I heard. She fell into step beside them, hands in her jacket pockets, watching the road ahead. My contact inside, said Velshira, was on her translation feed with the high seat relay for 40 minutes after you left the chamber. She was animated, apparently, by Velthara standards, which means she probably stood up. What was she telling them? That she'd encountered a data anomaly she couldn't classify, that the integration protocol needed a new outcome category, a pause, that she needed more time in sector. Rin thought about that. He thought about Velshira with the notebook in her hands, turning pages, and what it meant that she intended to stay, not to run more integrations, but to keep asking questions that weren't getting answered the expected way. Is that good or bad? Kai asked. Neither, Solis said. It's interesting. Which is possibly more dangerous than bad, and more valuable than good. She walked with them for a while, the 3 of them, in the specific quiet that settles on people who have been in a high-stakes situation, and come out the other side not necessarily having won, but having not lost, which was most of what survival felt like from the inside. The fallow fields stretched out around them, the wild growth coming back slowly, the kinds of plants that didn't wait for permission. After a while, Kai said, "She's going to report this up the chain, to the high seat. She's going to have to explain why the integration didn't complete the standard way." "Yes," Rin said. "That's going to cause them to look at us differently." "Yes. At all of us, the whole sector. Maybe all the contested zones." Rin walked. The cane found the ground. The leg hurt the way it always hurt, constant and workable background noise. The sky was doing its wrong purple thing with the clouds dragging west. "They've been looking at us for 112 years, he said finally. "Building models, making predictions, running integrations." He thought about Velshira sitting on the floor, turning the pages of a notebook that was just one man's careful record of what he'd noticed. Maybe it's time they started getting confused. Kai reached over and took the thermos from his father's pack without asking, found the last cold mouthful of chicory coffee, and drank it. "Yeah," he said, "probably past time." They walked in silence after that for a while. The thermos went back in the pack. The road curved, and the substation disappeared behind a rise, and ahead of them was just the long valley running west toward what had been the coast, the fallow fields and the wild grasses, and the sky being wrong in a way that was so constant now it was almost comfortable. Rin thought about the monthly correspondence. He thought about what it would look like, a notebook entry in one direction, a series of questions in the other, something building between two intelligences that had been studying each other from opposite sides of an occupation for 5 years, and had finally, improbably, ended up sitting on the same floor. He didn't know what it would produce. That was the interesting part. That was always the interesting part. He thought about Kai learning subsonic communication in 11 months because he'd been listening. He thought about the anthill. He thought about a song his mother used to sing, passed along to a kid on a porch, stored somewhere in his son's filing system of things that mattered, carried through an occupation and an integration attempt, and out the other side still intact. The small human textures. The things that were so persistently, specifically them that no process of alignment could find a clean grip. He pulled the notebook from his chest pocket, uncapped the pen, still walking because he'd learned a long time ago to do the writing whenever it came, not to wait for the right moment. He wrote, "Day 1847, sky still wrong, sun found. Integration Protocol 7 outcome, unconventional, first correspondence pending. Note, Velshira asked why humans write things down when we could keep them in our heads, told her, things written down can be given to someone else. She didn't have a response for that. Look into this." He capped the pen, put the notebook away. Solis glanced sideways at him, already. "Can't help it." She almost smiled. Kai looked at the notebook going back into his father's pocket and then looked at the horizon and the sky going wrong over it, and Rin could see him doing it, recording, the way he'd always recorded, the way he'd done at 14 in the doorway and at 7 watching the anthill, and at 13 on the porch steps counting fireflies. Taking the world in and putting it somewhere safe. In whatever internal system his son ran that the Velthara couldn't find a grip on because every time they reached for one thing, something else came up underneath it. Unfinished, in motion. Rin walked. His son walked beside him. The fallow fields breathed their slow, wild breath. Behind them, in a converted water treatment facility in the Fresno contested zone, a Velthara noble of the hereditary third seat was sitting with a human notebook in her hands and beginning, for the first time in 40 years of governance work, to understand that she had been asking the wrong questions. The three of them kept walking. The sky kept being wrong. The fallow fields kept reaching back toward something older and wilder. Behind them, at the Fresno substation, a Velthara noble of the third seat hereditary tier was sitting with a human notebook in her hands and a 40-year assumption in pieces around her, and beginning, very carefully, to write something down. Humanity had not won anything exactly. No territory had changed hands. No weapons had been fired. No great speech had been made over a defeated enemy. But somewhere in the Velthara Governance Archive, a file had been opened under Integration Protocol 7, Outcome Classification, Unconventional, and the field for asterisk subject status had been filled in with a word that had never appeared in that field before in 47 previous entries. The word was unresolved. Not pacified, not integrated, not lost. Unresolved, which for humanity was close enough to winning to work with.